I think we can start. We let people more and more people will join as we speak, but I think we can start. I'm really pleased today here on Democracy for Sale to be joined by Laleh Khalili, who is an absolutely brilliant writer, a scholar, a prolific journalist, an author of many books. And I think what's been a kind of common theme in your work is kind of tracing these ties between empire, capital, and control and surveillance. I think it's such a fascinating subject. I really recommend the recent piece that you wrote in the London Review of Books, all about the kind of big tech and the Pentagon and defense and lots of other things. And it'll be some of the conversation we have today. And I think it's so interesting, how you dig into this world of, especially Peter Thiel and Palantir, which is the kind of the company that I think is at the heart of the kind of modern military industrial tech complex. And it's a company that we're very interested in here at Democracy for Sale as well. I'm really struck that, we've written about Peter Thiel quite a bit, and this is somebody who's who said before, I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. Which is quite a remarkable kind of statement. And Palantir is, it's been very important in the United States. It's got contracts from to do with ICE deportations. We've actually been reporting on Democracy Sale actually just yesterday about its work at the police forces in the UK. At least around a dozen police forces in the UK have got contracts with Palantir. And there's actually a special government unit, this policing unit, that when we send FOI requests about them, rejects the request and actually basically coordinates local police forces to make sure that they do not give out any information specifically about their work on Palantir. And it's something that I want to talk to you a bit about too. And also, you've recently written a kind of really important, I think, new book, Extractive Capitalism, Extractive Capital: The Making of an Economic World Order. And I want to talk to you a bit about that as well, because you're speaking to us today from Washington DC, and you've been in the archives in DC, and I think that's something I'm really interested as well, and kind of that role of how capitalism itself is changing, which is something I think has really been narration your work. So, Laleh, welcome. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for being here. It's a
Thank
real
you.
pleasure.
And apologies to all of your listeners and watchers if it's a little bit noisy. I don't have headphones for the headphones and mic for the phone on which I have to do this, and I'm in a hotel and they're cleaning outside, so you guys are going to hear a lot of noise of people cleaning. So sorry about that.
No, thank you for warning us in advance. I guess let's start, I think, with Palantir, because it's your recent essay in the LRB is partly a review of Alex Karp, who's alongside Peter Thiel, the driving force of Palantir. Do you want to tell us a little bit about about actually Karp's book and what your take is on what Palantir is and what it's trying to do?
So you began by talking about Peter Thiel, and of course Peter Thiel is a very well-known person because he's part of the PayPal mafia, along with Elon Musk. They're like frenemies. They hate and love each other in equal measures. And Thiel is the person that everybody likes to talk about, but I actually find Alex Karp a much more interesting figure. And part of the reason that I find him a much more interesting figure is because he is, perhaps as an academic, this is part of it. He got a PhD in sociology from a university in Germany, in which he wrote a PhD about the role of symbols in political mobilization, and he actually writes about Adorno. He has a kind of a punky haircut, appears in various kinds of sort of investors videos, wearing just a t-shirt and being quite like performative. So he is quite an interesting character. An interesting and terrifying character, because he kind of, in a way that one sees across the Silicon Valley, has adopted or absorbed a whole lot of different affect and external representations or performances of being iconoclastic or being kind of a rebellious, but at the same time, he is actually the most standard kind of right-wing, possibly verging on fascist guy you could imagine. He describes himself as socialist, and as I wrote in the piece for the LRB, that socialist really needs some kind of a modifier ahead of it. And I'm not going to say more than that. I'm sure people can guess what I mean. But how
And
would you?
Laleh, just not to interrupt you too much, but just it's interesting as well. Like he's contributed. Whereas Thiel has given money to Trump's campaign, given money to JD Vance. Karp has given money to Democrats. Actually, Karp gave quite a bit of money to Cuomo ahead of his ill-fated New York mayoral run. So there's that aspect as well of his character.
There is that aspect of his character, but that's unsurprising, given that
Yeah.
the mainstream of the Democratic Party, like the mainstream of the Labour Party, is basically indistinguishable from their supposed rivals. Particularly when it comes to the operations of capital, it's completely unsurprising. In fact, for me, what's interesting is I'm following a lot of the news in the U.S. and a lot of actually Republicans are thinking about voting for Cuomo. So that also tells you something about where these kinds of politics stand. But what Karp's book is about, and he has written other stuff before as well, but what this book is about the way that and this is what actually quite verges on fascist, which is that he says that the Silicon Valley needs to stop dealing with frivolous things like consumerism, and it needs to focus instead on defense of Western values. And to defend Western values, it has to go into these fields of surveillance and military and whatever. And it sees itself as being part of this larger kind of wave of global conflict, and because of this being part of this global conflict, the book is essentially laying out a kind of a blueprint for the further extension of putting industry in the service of the U.S. empire. If we see the U.S. empire as being an empire capital supported by the largest military in human history, a military that spends that there's more U.S. spending on the Pentagon than the next 10 countries put together. If we see the U.S. as such an empire, Karp essentially is saying that we need to defend this in a large measure. But what it is also about, what this book is also about, is essentially a way of pitching for Palantir. A lot of these guys who actually are consultants or have a product now, as Yevgeny Morozov, a really great critic of these tech folks, has written, they consider themselves to be philosopher kings. And so they love writing books, but their books are essentially pitch books for their businesses. And that's what Palantir is. One of the other things about the book, Karp's book, which is interesting, is that it is co-authored with somebody else in his business. So the other person is also an employee of Palantir. But what is really interesting about it is that if you actually put it alongside the say the PhD that he'd written, and Moira Wiegel has written a really fabulous article about that PhD. If you put them alongside each other, you really can see the shallowness and the hollowness of this book and its sort of function as this kind of a pitch, as this kind of a way of selling business, essentially.
There's some incredible, and the shallowness, I think, is a really interesting way of talking about it too, because like we've seen, I think what's fascinating about Palantir is because like, as we've reported, there's so much opacity around them. There's intentional opacity around them, and that seems to be almost baked into the business model. But when these guys talked, it was quite a remarkable statement that Karp gave recently. He said, like, he was asked for, well, what in an ideal world, what would he like to do? And he said, I'd love the idea of getting a drone and having light fentanyl. Fentanyl's, a drug, a highly addictive and a lethal drug. Fentanyl-laced urine spraying on analysts that tried to screw us. There seems to be undergirding this as well as this kind of like, is this almost like a macho MAGA bro thing of like, we're these guys, and they basically kind of like, they're not just aiding ICE in terms of getting government contracts in America to help with deportations, but they're really actually, it feels to me, at least from a distance, aiding that whole philosophical push.
Yes, I mean there's a whole entire complex of online performance, which ranges from the incels that are living in their mother's basement and writing, incredibly hyper macho things, to these guys who have, I mean, we have a president in the US. We have a president that is basically an online troll, and is very good at trolling. That is the one thing he is really supremely good at. I mean, every people actually await his um, posts because they are hilarious trolling posts. And so, in some ways, I think that urine, the fentanyl-based urine comment is along that. It's feeding into that. And I think part of the reason that there is this kind of discourse also happening is actually some of it is just basic greed. So one of the things that's really interesting about Palantir is that a lot of financial analysts call it basically a meme stock. And what they mean by that is that there's a huge amount of retail interest, meaning ordinary folks are investing in it. Now, if anybody has followed these kinds of meme stock stories, like that happened with Bed Bath and Beyond or with GameStop, it's a kind of way that libertarian investors in the US try to evade large hedge funds, for example, or large institutional investors by doing mass small investments in a business. And when the whole GameStop, Bed Bath and Beyond, Hertz, etc., happened a few years back, there was something quite anti-authoritarian about it. But much like every libertarian instance in the United States, that anti-authoritarian very easily also lends itself to the supremely authoritarian, even fascist sort of set of sentiments. And I think that libertarianship, from going to help a GameStop to now investing in a Palantir is one of the things also that Alex Karp is trying to feed into. So he's very savvy in knowing the audience that really appreciates this. So when they had the investors call, they, in addition to having the regular analysts from Bank of America or whatever, they also had a couple of retail investors call in. And it was like this kind of a slightly cringe, actually not even slightly, very cringe, obsequious kind of love fest between people who are like, oh, just tell us how you're doing so well, kind of thing. And him and Karp feeding back into that. And so there's kind of something really kind of gross going on. And part of the reason that I don't hesitate calling it fascist is because of precisely this appeal to the little man, which actually tries to completely sideline class struggle, but uses a language of elite. It co-opts a lot of leftist, as I said, affect and performance in order to sell weapons of empire. It's really quite horrifying.
You've called Palantir. I think it'd be useful. I think maybe we might step back a little bit to look at the kind of what Palantir is and where it comes from. You've called it a child of the war on terror. Well, could you kind of unpack that a bit? Because I think that's really significant for understanding what this company is and what it's trying to do and how it's different.
Yeah. So in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, there was a moment where people thought that there was going to be a reduction in the amount of expenditures on the military-industrial complex in the United States. And this was quite devastating for a lot of companies that had made their dosh, using by making stuff for the Pentagon. And in fact, there was at that point in the 1990s a CIA venture capital firm called In-Q-Tel, which wanted to sort of capture some of the technologies that were coming out of the Silicon Valley and put it to use. Google Maps, actually, which was called something else before Google acquired them. The company that became Google Maps was actually, for example, funded by the CIA, funded by In-Q-Tel. When 2001 happens, and In-Q-Tel was ready to be wound up because, again, by the end of the 1990s, everybody thought, oh, well, there's no need for this. And then September 11th happened and the war on terror begins. And of course, In-Q-Tel gets an injection of funding, as does the military industrial complex in the United States. And around 2000 to 2003, In-Q-Tel actually makes a huge investment in the company that becomes Palantir. And part of what they were trying to do, and one of the things that came out of the September 11th, was that there was a lot of different intelligence agencies. The United States has more than a dozen and a half intelligence agencies. That's around 18 that we know of. And one of the things that had come out of September 11th was that these intelligence agencies had stores of information that could not speak to each other. So there was no commensurability between these different databases, between these different systems. And one of the things that Palantir claimed to be able to do, and when it started off, it was using the sort of the trendy, terminology of the time, which was data mining, not artificial intelligence. And they promised to be able to do data mining. So one of the suggestions that they had was that they could just go through all of these vast caches of data that had been collected by the CIA or the FBI or the NSA and try to come up with patterns and nuggets that could be used in terms of information. So this was where they started. And as they developed, one of the things that they must have noticed, which if anybody has ever worked, not just with the US government or any government, in fact, any large legacy corporation that has been around for more than a couple of decades, one of the things that you realize is that they can never really let go of their old systems. So what you end up having is layer upon layer. You have a palimpsest of different kinds of systems. And then if you have a very large organization, you have different bits of the organization that use different things. And so you can have, for example, a corporation, and I'm not even talking about the United States government, which is far vaster and far more unwieldy in those ways. But you can have a corporation that has its old servers running, computer languages that were written in the 1960s and 70s. You can have networks that run in one part of the office that are using regular LAN networks, but on computers that run Microsoft Word or some sort of a Microsoft operating system, and they have Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel holding information. In fact, Excel tends to be a huge kind of software for these. And you can have kind of new flashy servers that often are where, the user interface happens. Because obviously the customer interface is where you want it to be flashy. And so they're using much more up-to-date languages, much more up-to-date systems. And often these systems do not talk to each other. And so this is also the case with the United States government. And so I think after being involved with that kind of a data mining thing, Palantir realized that there was actually probably better money in trying to find a way to get all of these, try to find a kind of a central software to get all of these different kinds of systems to talk to each other. So, and that's not, that is quite a clever thing to do. Any large institution really needs something like that. But the point is that they're making themselves be a far more significant or far more important body. And they're getting huge kinds of contract where if such a system was designed in-house, it could be much more easily and efficiently done. We know this with the NHS. But of course, there's an entire ideology of privatization that lies behind this, which Palantir has managed to, tap into, and they're benefiting from. And not only it's an ideology, but one of the other things that is really quite horrendous about Palantir, but also about Elon Musk's the satellite SpaceX company, is the fact that they have actually used the U.S. courts in order to push forward their products. So in the U.S., SpaceX took the Air Force to court in 2014, I believe, and Palantir took the U.S. Army to court in 2015. And what they were saying was that our product is cheaper and you are required to look for, to get this cheaper product. And they use the same lawyer, and they managed to win both cases. And so, in some ways, they have thrown the entire weight of their billions by using avenues that are not available to ordinary folks, and which have essentially scuppered the use and sort of publicly held, more publicly accountable as systems. Because, of course, also, there is no way for us to have a look into the black box that is Palantir's software, because they can claim, proprietary commercial information status for them and not give us any information about, for example, how they've set up their algorithms, or what sorts of logic trees do they use in order to access information, or what sorts of data they have fed their pattern recognition sort of softwares on. So we don't have any information about this, which makes the use of Palantir, particularly in areas where questions of private data information, for example, NHS in the United Kingdom, or life and death type data, for example, facial recognition when used by the police. It makes it really important to have some accountability, and we don't.
Yeah, it's really striking. We've been sending we do a lot of freedom of information requests. We've been sending a lot of freedom of information requests to the police, the health service, the NHS health boards, trying to get some of this information out. And it's just blanket. And it's from an official government level. They're using centralized clearinghouses to effectively prevent us from attaining any information about it, about Palantir, about how Palantir are operating. Even basic aspects of contracts are being redacted. So it's really, and in a way you will not see in other areas. I guess one of the questions that comes up as well is that we've done work actually looking at Palantir and the NHS, because they had this huge, big £330 million contract. And actually, interestingly, McKinsey, because the rollout was being so slow, McKinsey actually got an £8 million contract to help NHS hospitals take up the software. But we found that lots of hospitals aren't using it because they don't think it's particularly up to speed, and it doesn't, as you say, legacy organizations have a lot of their own software too, and it's really hard to put on top of it, which kind of makes you wonder, how effective is what Palantir is selling? That feels to me like a big question with all of this too.
So this is a really interesting question. As with everything that has to do with quite complex systems, which are easy to cloak in jargon, like artificial intelligence, it's 50. I say it's 50% bullshit and 50% sinister stuff. And the 50% that is bullshit is an enormous amount of hype. Obviously, they have to hype everything to sell it. For me, what's the best example of that is that after Twitter lost a huge amount of its value because of Elon Musk's antics, adding Grok to Twitter suddenly acquired it the 40 billion that it had lost in value. So, I mean, it's kind of like, okay, yeah, well, that's how it works. And I think the fact that we can't, for example, opt out of Google's Gemini, which has resulted in me abandoning Google altogether, is another factor in this. They are desperately trying to sort of find a way to raise money. And of course, this is one of the ways that they do it, is buy it through hype. So I think that that's one of the things that is really important to recognize. We also know that a lot of their systems are just shit at what they do. So, for example, in Southern California, police departments actually took up Palantir's database. It was Southern or Northern California, but it was in California. Police departments took up Palantir's facial recognition sort of database, and it ended up that they actually ended up arresting and killing somebody who wasn't the person that they were looking for. So the facial recognition software actually didn't work. And when that happened, it resulted in a lot of the police forces in the United States, which were scheduled or which were in line to get Palantir, actually setting that aside because they felt like it wasn't doing the thing that it needed to do. And that was facial recognition. Even with stuff that had to do with data and information, I think Chicago Police Department discovered that the data was so bad that it pointed people, for example, to somebody's cousin rather than to themselves when they were looking for somebody. So these are not really great systems, but because they have a kind of a Well, they have height, they have connections, and they have the force of the billions, and the courts, the courts behind them. They can continue to sell their product. And I think they are savvy in that they do put people in place that have extensive inroads into the political sphere. In the United Kingdom, Palantir's UK head is the grandson of Oswald Mosley, the black shirt, the British fascist, who happens also to be a major Tory activist and major Tory donor. So although they also are quite happy to work with Labour. Labour is quite happy to work with these fascists, and horrifyingly, because I'm not 100% certain that any of these politicians have anybody who actually knows anything about anything advising them on this stuff. They just hear AI and, Keir Starmer thinks that that's the way to go in order to revive our moribund economy.
It's quite striking. It does feel like they've been very effective at kind of, as you say, getting into this kind of almost AI zeitgeist. Like we've done a lot of stories in AI lobbying here in the UK, and it's quite remarkable. We've got the tech secretary Peter Kyle going to meet the head of Google DeepMind and saying, I want you to sense check all of our policy on AI. Similarly, meeting Amazon and saying, I'm going to talk to the regulator, the competitions, the markets authority, to kind of lobby your case, and actually then later on, a few months later, the head of the Competition and Markets Authority gets the heave ho, and somebody who used to be in Amazon gets appointed. And actually, see, Rachel's got a comment: wasn't Peter Manson's company, Global Counsel, involved with advising Palantir? Yes, they were. And actually, when Keir Starmer went to Washington DC in February, he went for a meeting in, guess where, Palantir's DC offices. So no, that's the thing I'm really struck by, as someone who writes a lot about lobbying and influence. Sometimes it feels to me like these are people who are really, really effective at bringing in outside, bringing in the UK case, former government ministers, a former defence secretary, Leo Doherty's gone there, Tom Watson, the former deputy Labour Party leader, is also an advisor in the House of Lords. Like, getting these constellations, and I think understanding that fundamentally a lot of people in positions of power don't understand what they're talking about, what Palantir
They
are
don't.
talking about.
They don't. And Nick Clegg, don't forget, Nick Clegg has gone
Oh
off to
yes,
work
how could we
also.
forget Nick Clegg? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, it is kind of horrifying. And there is this entire complex of power that runs alongside, of course, money and contracts and advisory stuff. But it goes also deeper than that. There are forms of intimacy and friendship that are going on. I mean, just I'm really curious about the paparazzi photos that are going to come out of Jeff Bezos's wedding in Venice, because it's going to show to us exactly what kinds of, the philosopher kings of today, the sort of the mega billionaires that dictate so much of our policies, the people that don't pay their taxes, but they can essentially decide what kind of politics is played out in all of these places. Or these are the kinds of people that are going to be there, and I'm really curious about who is attending. Much the same way that I was really curious about who was going to be attending, Trump's inauguration, and who was standing in a row next to Elon Musk. I think that there is something kind of horrific and horrifying about this, and I'm a Marxist. And you're going, and you're sitting here and you're going, these are the, the state is supposed to be the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, very famously written by Marx, and the shamelessness with which they now demonstrate this complete and utter capture of the state apparatus by unfettered, unashamed, utterly craven, amoral monsters that are a bunch of billionaires running these tech agencies is something that we probably haven't seen, since the Gilded Age of, the late 19th and early 20th century.
And I think that kind of begs this, another question behind that. Totally, you watched them. Like, you saw this in the run up to the inauguration, as well as people giving money. Everyone starts, writing their check for $1 million. That's their kind of, that's your kind of like, it's the pocket money that you have to be at the table. It's like, you're going to play poker. We had, the hostage video, the Mark Zuckerberg hostage video, Jeff Bezos, using the opinion page of the Washington Post, and more incredibly aggressively, it has to be said as well, including op-eds from the likes of Kirsty Noem, but to using his both his newspaper, but also I think it was $30 or $40 million Amazon is spending on a biopic of Melania Trump. These really are, this is old fashioned corruption in many respects. But there's also behind it, it feels like these firms and the people who run them, and they're almost uh, the firms and the people involved are one and the same. Yeah, they're analogous. Bezos, Amazon, Zuckerberg, Meta. Like these are the same things. There's almost like a kind of Giorgio Agamben-esque in kind of embodiment of the company. What does it mean, like, if we're going backwards into that Gilded Age style ownership? Like, what does it mean for democracy, even in its liberal form that we understand as checks and balances, representation with a small L? What does it mean? Like, can democracy in that form coexist with this sort of capture?
I don't really think so. I mean, I think that we're already seeing the way that this kind of capture is. In the United States, for example, the Citizens United court case, which essentially resulted in the revocation of any kind of a legal limitation on contributions by people to different campaigns, has been enormously detrimental to democratic politics. It has resulted in the flow of complete and utter bullshit instead of sort of news. And it's kind of a horrifying thing to see this happening. But there's also something else, that is that people become depoliticized when they see the kind of inability to challenge the billionaires. There was a time where we would be able to, I mean, even in a very limited form, even in a form that was very decidedly racialized, for example, you could go to the polling booth and you could register your vote. But right now, corporations in the United States certainly have more rights than individual voters do, and a dollar buys more power than an individual vote does. And I think that to me is kind of horrifying. And I think that one of the things that it points to is that the response to such complete consolidation of power as it was at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century will probably be a wave of violence. And I think whether it's workplace violence or whether it's violence on the street, whether it's somebody like shooting the CEO of a healthcare company because they don't have any other avenue of recourse, there is going to be a wave of violence. And I think that it's not something that I particularly am excited about, but it is going to be, but I think there will be some form in which those that have been completely marginalized and set aside are going to have to find an avenue of expression for how they for the way that they have been marginalized, and it's inevitable. I mean, this is just the way. Anybody who has studied social movements, or anybody who has studied political contention historically or has studied revolutions, knows that there has to be some kind of an avenue of participation, or you're inevitably going to have the kinds of clashes that are going to be transformative, perhaps not in the best possible way imaginable. Or you're going to have such unbelievably unfettered blowing up of these kinds of hype bubbles that you're going to end up having a massive crash, like the dot-com crash of the 2000, or like the 2008 banking crash, or going back to if the end of the Gilded Age came with the Great Depression. And so there is the system cannot bear this degree of consolidation of power in the hands of a bunch of people that are just patting each other on the back and feeding each other, allowing each other to feed at the trough. And the disparity in their wealth and access with the wealth and access of the or the lack thereof of the ordinary folks. And so something will happen, and that is, it's going to be enormous.
It feels actually in some ways like those two things you're talking about, the prospects of violence, and we've seen some of this already with lawmakers being, this is not like it, on some level, I think sitting in the UK can sound hyperbolic, but it's not even here. We've had lawmakers killed in Britain too, but especially in the United States, what we're seeing. But what's striking, I think, as well, is that these two things could be conjoined. If
Yeah,
someone put in a comment in the chat, and if you've got questions, do put your questions in. We'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions too, but is about cryptocurrency and the potential, the way in which cryptocurrency is both fueling a huge amount of corruption, but also has the potential to create a huge bubble that just explodes in a way that it could be very partisan too. And that we spoke to James Bloodworth, who's an interesting book recently called The Lost Boys about the Manosphere. But there's a lot of the crypto bros, a lot of these young men in particular have
yeah,
assets in crypto. Have translate,
yeah,
these are people who've never seen these things go boom in a bad way. And like that could have, and you could imagine Donald Trump, who previously been a bit of a crypto skeptic, is now one of the biggest crypto boosters. He's made hundreds of millions, if not billions, out of these ridiculous meme
yeah,
coins.
yeah.
I could go on, but you can see where we could have a huge conflagration.
And I think that is one of where also the whole Palantir investor, kind of the meme investor type thing is also heading. Is that, and I think this is what's terrifying about the potential wave of violence that is coming. In previous, and again, looking at this historically, because I'm a dorky academic and we like to do those kinds of historical analogies. When the end of the Gilded Age came, there was an organized left that actually pushed for example, in the United States for the New Deal. And this organized left appeared through unions, it appeared through various avenues. And so it actually, it in some ways channeled that revolutionary force into the particular kinds of reforms that were necessary in this country in order for not letting people die, in the Dust Bowl. What is really horrifying right now is that an organized left is very fragmented, both in the United Kingdom and the United States. And where, for example, the youth have organized as they did with Corbyn, the way that the sort of system completely and totally shut down all the possibilities of their mobilization. I'm very nervous about what might happen with Zohran Mamdani in New York, because if the same thing happens, this is going to result in, again, that closure of an avenue of participation for those youth. It's one of the few places where the left are organizing, whereas the right is organized, mobilized, and in the United States, they're armed. And so if a conflagration comes, it is going to be from the right, and it's not going to be nice. It's going to be incredibly violent and bloody. And I don't think that I really genuinely think that the people that are sitting at the heads of these corporations and the people that are sitting in the governments that are feeding into these corporations don't have any idea about what is coming. They are so unbelievably disconnected from the reality of what's going on. They're so completely and totally embubbled in in naysayers and cronies. They are only listening to one another. There is no avenue for other voices to be heard. And when those other voices are heard, they're quickly tamped down. That if they genuinely, I don't think, know what is coming.
And it's interesting what you're saying on that, because like at the same time we've seen like these companies, are producing, like Palantir is a good example, but not just Palantir, using AI, using surveillance to produce new forms of warfare, new forms of weapons. We've seen some of this actually that's used in Gaza, that's used in Iran. Like, you know, it's a bit of a disconnect in some respects, but at the same time, we're seeing this huge increase in surveillance capitalism that's been driven by these firms. So on one hand, they're kind of oblivious to the social realities on the ground this world is creating, but are at the same time trying to create, like it seems to me, like unprecedented levels of surveillance.
Yes. I mean, of course they are, but it's also really important to not take all the claims for these kinds of AI that are being made, and algorithmic warfare that is being made, very seriously. One of the things that is, for example, really interesting is that Sinwar, the sort of the organizer, the military leader of Hamas, was killed by a drone. right, by a quadcopter drone that actually also videotaped them. But they had no information about who he was. They didn't know who he was until he was killed. So on the one hand, they can claim that they have full and complete surveillance, but on the other hand, there was this guy who, for 3 days, along with a couple of other people, fought them using, kind of weaponry that were decades old, and it was only after he was killed and they came and took his keffiyeh off his face that they realized that they had killed Sinwar. So on the one hand, they make enormous claims for this kind of the killing ability, and on the other hand, their ability is limited by certain sets of interventions. Now, technology can be an incredibly powerful form of or a kind of an inroad for these terrible types of violence. I mean, look at the fact that Israel's intelligence agencies were able to penetrate, for example, the supply chains for beepers into Lebanon, which of course also killed lots of civilians and doctors and nurses and other people that use beepers as well. But never for them, that's just acceptable collateral damage. But technology does provide this kind of an avenue for these people to do it. And so they make enormous claims for it because, of course, their livelihoods depend on those enormous claims.
Yeah, so there's a kind of, it's a bit, I guess we're back to that question as well, like the relationship between bullshit and sinister, which seems to be kind of an overarching part of this. I know you've got archives to go back to, but I wouldn't mind just briefly touching as well on your new book and this idea of extractive capital, because I was really struck. I also listened to your excellent podcast with the LRB, and like this kind of almost what you described as almost like a new regime of capitalism, right? And I wanted you just to unpack a little bit. What do you mean by extractive capitalism, and how has that changed?
Yeah, I actually don't think it's that much of a new regime. In fact, I think the late imperial 19th, even into all the way to the middle of the 20th century, where the global south produced the basic commodities required for industrial capitalism in the global north, that sort of politics has remained. And there was much the same way that there was, for example, a moment of social democracy in the countries of the global north. There was also a moment, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. For about 3 decades, you had this kind of a possibility of a more equal society. And you also had this moment of decolonization for 2 or 3 decades in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And we have now, and then every single mechanism of capital and violence was brought to bear on this in order to actually to roll back the achievements of, for example, sovereignty over resources, to roll back the ability of the states to determine how they were going to, which investors they were going to take and how they were going to take those investments and what use they were going to put those monies on. And you saw this kind of a reinstantiation of the power of the former imperial countries of Europe plus the United States in pushing forward kinds of financial mechanisms that made it impossible for countries of the global south to actually develop their economies in line with the kinds of social and political ideals that they had. Among these are a whole raft of different things that goes from, for example, the World Bank's investor-state dispute resolution mechanism, which always rules on behalf of the investors, foreign investors. And this mechanism was put into place precisely in response to the new the newly independent countries of the global south, former colonies, who wanted control over their resources. Or you ended up having these kinds of, Bibles of austerity that were preached by the IMF and the World Bank. And so, but in addition to that, you have also structures in place that, aside from these kinds of forms of direct imposition of particular sets of practices, the structures themselves do that. And dollar denomination of the global trade, and particularly of oil, for example, is at the center of this post-Second World War regime, and it is the thing upon which it is the foundation upon which the U.S. power rests, because the U.S. pretty much can spend any amount of dollar, can print any amount of dollar, because the dollar is the currency in which global economy is denominated. This is basically like how the United Kingdom was with the sterling at the end of the 19th century and in the first couple of decades of the 20th. And so what we're seeing is a repetition of, again, some of those Gilded Age practices, but the book focuses on oil, sand, and trade, really, those areas of my own research and interest. But it's not intended to be an academic book. It is a whole. It is really actually aimed at trying to explain how things that are often quite opaque and cloaked, as I said, in the language of jargon, but also are behind sort of, let's say, political paywalls. It's to explain how those things work.
I guess I'll leave, maybe I think it'll probably be my last question, but it feels like we've come full circle in some ways back to talk about America's empire.
Yes.
And I'm really struck with a point you've made before, which I don't think is made often enough, that like in some ways America's. I lived in the States in my early 20s in New York. I was a student, and around the time of the Iraq War, I was living in New York, and I was always really struck that this aspect. I was taught by David Harvey, actually, you probably remember, but he's still there at Cooney. But what really struck me was how little we talked about America as an empire, and I didn't grow up in that way of thinking about it, America as an empire. He was one of the people that made me think about it. But I think you make this point that almost because of America's role in talking so much about evangelizing for democracy, we don't really see that aspect of its empires. This is a two-part question, if you will let me, kind of an academic question. But to what extent do you think that's true? But also, to what extent do you think that America's now role in almost being an anti-democratic citadel, where we see people from other parts, we see actually actively trying to get involved in other countries' elections in a very overt way, in a very, in trying to push the kind of far right in numerous countries. What's that going to do to America's empire?
I mean, this was happening in the 1960s, right? It's not, again, even this is not really that new. The U.S. could be claiming that it is looking for democracy, and then it was actually overthrowing democratically elected states, governments in a lot of countries, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, you name it. And I think that the degree to which the U.S. empire was actually recognized as such, in particular in the 1960s, also have to do with the internal contentions there. Because, of course, for example, if you look at the Black Panthers had absolutely no doubt that the U.S. was an empire. And in fact, their entire program of action was about this recognition of the interconnectedness of their struggles for rights for African American people, and this imperial kind of a force that was there. So I think that that's really important to recognize. I think what is really interesting about this moment, which hasn't happened before, and I think this is what distinguishes it, is the extent to which the kind of know-nothings that are in power in the United States and Trump in particular, but also Bannon and others, are taking actions which in fact undermines the kind of hegemony producing apparatuses that the U.S. had constructed after the Second World War. And these are the kinds of things which an idiot like Elon Musk can come and claim, like, for example, that the USAID is just a liberal institution, where the USAID was initially, primarily and entirely put in place as a way of ensuring that the U.S. counterinsurgency and all of the different places where it was engaged in counterinsurgency was followed through by the kinds of institutional mechanisms that institutionalize the gains of those counterinsurgencies, if there were such things. So to me, it is hilarious that these people don't even know the history of these institutions, and they're undermining them. I mean, there was a moment in which all of the financial newspapers, which are the only ones that are worth reading, really, and Financial Times is the best one in that regard, were actually asking the question of whether the exorbitant privilege of having the world trade denominated in dollar was being undermined by Trump, and there has been some questions about that. So this is a new moment in that regard. because of course the US has never stopped interfering in other people's in other people's elections. The US has never not been at war somewhere. And the US has, from the very moment where it became independent, has been an imperial, well, a colonial at first, and an imperial power, with its extension on the continental the United States, with its extension in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. It has always been an imperial power. It is just that there is no one else actually standing in the way of it. And perhaps, this is another moment to quote one of the cliches, or one of the things that Marx had said that has become a cliche, and that is that perhaps this is a moment in which the US empire contains the seeds of its own destruction.
I think that's a very, very fitting place to end this conversation, Laleh. I think it's a very, very interesting question. I think we in the UK will be watching a lot of this very closely. I think you've done such a great job of, I think, helping us to understand both that context, but also the role of companies like Palantir and how they're kind of really deeply implicated in that. Like, I highly recommend everybody to follow Laleh's work. It's fantastic, and it's kept me.
Thank you.
I found a source of information for many years, so I'm absolutely delighted to have you on with us. And so thank you so much. Thank you for giving your time.
I've admired your work too, and thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your time in DC, and I look forward to hearing more about what comes out of the archives.
All right, lovely. Take care.
Thanks everyone who joined. Take care now. Have a lovely day, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.